Hey creeps, it's Horror Free For All. Welcome to my inaugural video of a brand new series I'm doing called Discovering Anthology. Discovering Anthology has been a want on my list to do for this channel for some time because anthology films are honestly my favorite type of movies to experience. And I know anthology films have a terrible reputation next to found footage, for example, because historically, anthologies, found footage, and shot on video movies, and plenty of other low on the totem pole film styles out there get lambasted for traditional low budget, low acting quality, and low writing quality they often bring to the table. Now, I don't experience every single anthology movie that comes out. I am a smart window shopper after all. But occasionally movies will catch my attention and will gravitate me to want to buy it. Or sometimes I'll go out and hunt movies and I'll stumble across a random anthology that I just have to pick up. And the latter actually happened to me recently. And I discovered this little anthology film from 2014 I never heard about, but I felt compelled to check out. And I decided to check out Locker 13. Locker 13, you probably have never heard of this anthology film, and I don't blame you. It was, I believe, a crowd-funded film from a small studio who actually had some relatively known actors from yesteryear. You might recognize a few when you look at the title card on the bill for this movie. There's plenty of actors such as John Grise, who played Uncle Rico in Napoleon Dynamite, Ricky Schroeder, who was, I think, in a 1970s or 80s sitcom I don't know the name of, but I recognize his face. You have Rick Hoffman, who's been in quite a few things in the past. You have Tatiana Ali, who played the little sister Ashley in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and many others. I looked at the synopsis on the back cover and realized that these stories sound very Twilight Zone or Amazing Stories-esque. And considering that it's a modern interpretation of that idea, it made me want to check out the movie. However, I had my reservations with it because of the fact that Twilight Zone and Amazing Stories have tried to come out with modern reboots and have ultimately failed with audiences and were almost swiftly canceled after they came out. But more on that later. After watching Locker 13, it made me realize that what this movie was trying to do was perhaps too little too late, and it came out completely in the wrong decade. When I say that, I'm saying that this movie was off by a good 40 to 45 years. Here's the thing about this film. This film is framed like most low-budget anthology films that you'll come across out in the ether, and trust me, you can go on Tubi right now and probably find close to 200, and out of the 200, you may have only ever heard of 10 out of those. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some diamonds in the rough of a lot of the low-budget anthology movies. Is this one a gem in the rough for you? Possibly. It depends on what you're looking for. I think most people, at the end of the day, if they watch this movie and are accustomed to modern anthologies, they might consider this mildly refreshing for trying to be something different in a landscape of anthologies, trying to mimic what Creepshow, Trick or Treat, and various other popular modern anthologies that are more successful than these former has-been existential properties such as Amazing Stories and Twilight Zone. Which brings me to what this film is about. The wraparound story, as most anthology film fans would expect, is on full display here. You have a runner of a Western attraction who has hired a new janitor who will work the night shift. But on his first day, the manager has decided to take the janitor under his wing and talk to him to get to know him. And almost immediately, the manager realizes that the janitor might have a shady past, so to speak, trying to break through to him and give him some advice on how to carry his life forward while he's going to be working at the attraction. The manager decides to share stories. The first story is called Down and Out. It's about a boxer, played by Ricky Schroeder, who is way past his prime. And he takes out his frustrations in a local gym where he has figuratively burnt out for the past few years. One day, in a fit of rage and frustration about his career, he's in the locker room and realizes that his locker fees haven't been paid and he owes the gym owner some money. That's when he's confronted with a janitor with a proposition and a pair of very old boxing gloves. And all the janitor says is, "You can have these because I don't see you as a boxer, I see you as a fighter." Now, the older gentleman boxer doesn't think much of this, but decides to put the gloves for good use because he needs them for a fight. And almost immediately, he notices that the gloves give him some power as he brutally beats a man in the ring and sends the man to a hospital. However, the gym trainer notices the older boxer and his tenacity to fight and realizes that he might be a good option to put up for an upcoming main event fight that's going to happen that he wanted to use the other boxer for, but since he's been injured, he has no other options now. This excites the older boxer, of course, and he, of course, goes to the event, and this culminates in the final act of the story, where we get caught up on the events of the fight that will take place that night and what exactly has happened with this older boxer and what he has done to yet another opponent. Now, when this realization sets in, the boxer must make a choice. Does he continue down this path with these boxing gloves that are giving him success and notoriety, but at the cost of his morals and his own sanity? Or does he do away with it all and give away success to have his chin up high, so to speak? This may or may not backfire in his case, but if you see the story, you'll see what I'm talking about. Once that story is over, as the rest of the segments will go, the attraction owner keeps up to speed with these stories as he's taking the janitor around various places of the property, which kicks off the second story called the Byzantine Order. Set further in the past, presumably around the turn of the 20th century, maybe in the 1910s or 1920s, two pals are set off to a initiation where all men in the initiation wear fez hats, and the main gentleman who's being initiated has yet to acquire his hat, but he is there for that said reason. Now, while at this event, he doesn't know what to expect of this secret society, but they seem like a bunch of older aristocratic gentlemen that have a mildly perverted side. There's a big cake in the middle of the lobby room where they're all congregated at, and inside is a attractive younger woman wearing a black wig. She is filling in as a replacement for another entertainer that they usually hire for these events, and she is excited to get to perform and make some extra cash. However, the gentlemen discover that she has possibly brought along her young infant who's hiding inside the cake, which she tries to mask and still entertain the men with in despite of. Now, unbeknownst to the guy who's being initiated, he notices some weird behavior going on with the gentleman in the initiation and sees a conversation with a quote-unquote leader in a side room of a much older gentleman in a wheelchair. And this prompts his attention to want to fixate to this gentleman in the wheelchair. Now, once everybody is caught up to speed with the entertainer and what needs to be done because something has gone wrong, the entertainment has to come to a close, and the leader comes in to put a pause to it all and give credence as to why some things are going wrong. And let's just say the person being initiated thinks that there's some shady shit going on. And after seeing his best friend that he's come to the initiation with possibly get bodily harmed, and another random person at the event get harmed by this older gentleman. That shit has hit the fan. There is a recontextualization in the story of what is actually real and what's really going on and what all that entails. And this possibly plays a role into the person being initiated feeling like they've been duped in some way or the other. But there is a pretty ingenious plot twist by the end where there's certain characters that we haven't thought about in a while and how this all pertains to them. And let's just say somebody who has gotten overzealous on trying to get one over on somebody gets what's coming to them. Now we cut back to the wraparound story, and they're now in a new place again, and we cut into the third segment called The Suicide Club. And The Suicide Club is by far the shortest segment of this entire film. You have a man down on his luck on the top of a skyscraper, thinking about all the pain and suffering he's been going through in his life, and he's about to jump off the top of the building to plummet to his death. However, he's stopped by a gentleman who's played by Jason Marsden. If you don't know who Jason Marsden is, he starred in series such as Full House back in the 90s, I believe. I remember seeing him in that. And he had smaller bit roles back in the day as well. Now, Jason's character is a enigma, so to speak. He somehow knows that this man is about to commit suicide and is there to essentially coach him to actually do it, which throws the man off guard, and he starts to probe as to why he's being coached to commit suicide. And let's just say the gentleman there coaching him doesn't necessarily want him to do it. He's just there to neutrally coach and bring out whatever they want to do because he believes in free will, and starts to probe more questions into the would-be gentleman to commit suicide. Perhaps the reasons why they're doing what they're doing. And once the guy becomes more on edge, the gentleman from the Suicide Club pulls a gun on him and forces him to his knees and confess really why he's up there in the first place. And through this conversation, this perhaps coaches the would-be person to commit suicide to rethink and reevaluate their situation. And we get the real realization at the end of perhaps what was the real motive behind everything done there. Going from that, we cut back into the wraparound again, which leads into the fourth story called The Author. Now, The Author is by far, I think, my favorite segment of this entire movie. If you're a fan of James Wan's and Lee Whannell's Saw franchise, this might do it for you a little bit. This one is about a hitman who has been hired by a woman to essentially kill a man. However, there's 3 women that have a strong motive to have this man killed, and all 3 of them have been either current, past, or relatively recent lovers of this man. And he has chained and locked all 3 women up in a room and has decided to interrogate all 3 of them to figure out which one was the person that put a hit out on the man. And all 3 women have their own distinct motives. You have a blonde woman who was pretty much a side piece, who had her nudes and sex tapes put on the internet by this guy, had her emotions run through by this man, was promised the world that he would leave his wife, and it never happened, and she felt envious of his actual wife in the situation and possibly got tired of waiting and wanted the man gone. Another woman is also another side piece lover who is not necessarily fluent all that much in English, but she looks like the spitting image of his wife. And this woman had a pregnancy scare that perhaps is the reason why she wanted to off the man, because maybe she wanted the child to blackmail him or actually have a family with him. And then the third woman is his actual wife, who might have motives that we don't necessarily get up front, but you learn in the story, perhaps having to do with attention, being valued as an actual wife, and all that entails to be a wife. Now, the hitman, in his over-the-top performance, has a silenced pistol going around, shooting at the woman, maiming one woman in particular for trying to fuck with him a little bit, which makes this situation a bunch more tense than it probably needs to be, but it serves up great effect for the story. And as the story goes along, we get to see all three women have to come up with their own motives to admit to the hitman, because if they don't come up with one that's convincing enough, they're going to be killed. And you possibly find out which ones do get killed and which one is going to be set free, essentially. Now, once this story is over, we're done cutting through to different stories in the wraparound. And the wraparound culminates with the janitor who's been hired in the beginning by the manager of the property now having his own experience. Now, because he's the nighttime janitor, he's often cleaning the locker room where the employees change and whatnot. And he's given the locker 13, which, if I haven't mentioned, like the movie's title suggests, is a heavy influence on majority of the stories in the bunch, because all of them involve lockers in some ways, and specifically a locker with the number 13. Now, the janitor realizes early on, while he's been given the locker, that there's another door in the back of it, and he realizes that a parallel version of himself that actually lives a day behind him is on the other side. And as they communicate, he realizes that the version of himself that lives in the past has no intention of really helping him in his present. As a matter of fact, as he gives him information in the story to perhaps give him a leg up and help him, he notices that it's actually working. And everything seems to be turning around for himself in the past, but himself in the present is still dealing with a lot of baggage and bullshit that he brought with him to this job. This culminates in a situation where he sees an opportunity to possibly get rich with his version of himself in the past by giving him some lottery numbers that only he would know, so that he can give it to himself in the past to win, and they can split the profits. And we find out in the story, he really does need the profits to pay off some debts that might cost him his life. Well, this culminates in the climax of the story where there's a do or die moment for this janitor, and he has to make a rash decision to save his own hide and make his life better. And he perhaps capitalizes on that opportunity. And where it ends leaves on a very weird note. And we'll get into that in the negatives of the movie. Once this story is over, the wraparound concludes with the manager, played by John Grice, the entire movie, going out in an epilogue type of way of him interacting with the door in the locker room in Locker 13 with his own parallel version of himself. And it perhaps lends credence of what he's exactly doing with the janitor the entire film. And I'll just leave it at that. Now, up front, Locker 13 was a refreshing watch for me. Coming from somebody who watches mainly monster schlock like Creepshow and Tales from the Crypt and Turn Your Brain Off horror most of the time, this movie made me think a little bit. Now, here's the thing about this movie compared to its close cousins, Twilight Zone and Amazing Stories. Twilight Zone and Amazing Stories predicated themselves on existentialism. And if you don't know what that means, it's essentially about plugging your mind into the mind of a character and thinking about it through the lens and how they see things and how that can bring out the horror of the situation. What Locker 23 does instead is it tries to mimic that mentality and framework of an Amazing Stories tale or Twilight Zone tale, but tries to amplify the thinking in a more modern, big-brained, bigger picture context that is popular in horror these days. And that is just simple thought provocation. And what I'm getting at with that is, what is the story trying to say with its themes? Because at the end of the day, You can disagree with this. That is more popular in modern trends of horror than existentialism. Now, I know existentialism is still popular. It makes movies like The Truman Show what it is. It makes plenty of other films that kind of predicate on the idea of putting yourself in the thought of a character in the situations they're in. And that's how you're made to feel in the horror side of things. I get that, but today's audiences have very short attention spans. And most people don't give a shit about other people these days, if we're being real. Everybody just wants to be shocked, wowed, and awed. Which is why stuff like Creepshow became relevant again. Because at the end of the day, Creepshow has always been a franchise that has offered substance with the schlock and the gore. And audiences are predisposed these days just to have visual eye candy with effects or gore, practical effects, blood, splatter everywhere. But when you have the substance there, it legitimizes it and it makes it feel like it's quote-unquote elevated. And I hate the term elevated horror, but that's really what audiences kind of want these days. They want more thematic stuff with horror, right? They want a schlocky horror movie that's over-the-top gratuitous, but it wants to have something that ties symmetrically in the underlying portion of the movie, aka the underbelly. They want to have subtext, layers to peel back, thematic ties, what this is all supposed to metaphorically represent. You know, stuff like that. Locker 13 is trying to bridge the gap between existentialism and thought provocation, which is essentially all the stuff I just mentioned there. Now, here's the thing. You can really sit back and roast this movie for having a low budget, for having some weak writing in areas. As a matter of fact, the middle segment, The Suicide Club, has fuck all to do with the Locker 13 gimmick. And it makes you question, since it is the shortest segment, why the hell it's even in the movie. I'm going to say this. The stories, in terms of quality, are mostly decent at best. Down and Out was a 3 out of 5 stars, which is a low decent. Byzantine Order for me was a upper decent at a 3.25 out of 5 stars. The Suicide Club, I thought this one was kind of meh. I gave it a 2 out of 5. The fourth story, The Author, my favorite one, topped out at a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And the wraparound segment that concluded with the janitor, The Other Side, I also gave a 3 out of 5 stars because of that fucking ending. I think the biggest problem with all 5 stories in particular is that they're relatively short, and in some cases, like the very first segment, Down and Out, there's some disjointed storytelling and just lack of visuals to kind of make it pop. As a matter of fact, there is an entire boxing event that you're kind of tantalized to want to see that you actually never see happen. Now, I can't tell you if that's because of budget or what, but that's fucked up. And going to the other stories, The Suicide Club was so insanely short, and it was almost just like a mini bottle segment that has fuck all to do with the Locker 13 gimmick. Why the hell is this segment in the movie? It's fine for what it is, I guess, but seriously? Now, The Byzantine Order, The Author, and The Other Side were still fun as well. I think The Author and The Byzantine Order, they're kind of flat feeling and feel kind of meanderish at times. And to be honest, there's some parts of the story that you just completely see coming, and that kind of sucks all the fun out of it. As for The Other Side, it's a pretty cut and dry story that you can see what it's trying to tell you thematically, but the ending makes zero fucking sense. And I don't want to get into it because I'll spoil it for you. But yeah, given the context of the situation, it has no real weight on the legitimacy of how it can even happen. I'm going to say this as well. You know, getting into more of the negatives about this movie. It's not my traditional type of horror want. I'm going to be upfront. I'm not the biggest Twilight Zone fan. I said it. You know, I think Twilight Zone is a very influential show. I think Rod Serling's a very influential writer. But given what I've experienced in my lifetime, growing up with what I've grown up with, Twilight Zone to me just comes across as more childish, lame as shit most of the time. Kind of like what you see in this film, Locker 13. Now, Locker 13's problem is that I think it's trying to borrow from its heyday predecessors in a modern time. And it came out quite a few years before Twilight Zone tried to reboot again, and Amazing Stories tried to reboot again. But seeing that their failures happened as swiftly as they did, it kind of answers the question for me right there of why Locker 13 remained obscure and got poor critic reviews. Modern audiences just don't see the appeal in Twilight Zone anymore. Yes, there are flukes out there like Black Mirror that feel like modern Twilight Zone rips. But at the end of the day, Black Mirror is still more of a big-brained thought on the Twilight Zone idea. Like I said before, Twilight Zone is almost all existentialism. Black Mirror goes into modern thought provocation that is more trendy and more in line with modern viewers. And perhaps that's why Black Mirror has kind of defied the odds as a traditional anthology show in a modern time where it's hard to kind of stay on a steady track in anthology and especially maintain consistency on a mass love scale, so to speak. At the end of the day, this film fits into that Jordan Peele reboot of The Twilight Zone and the Apple TV reboot of The Amazing Stories show. They were short-lived because they tried the older approach and didn't quite convey and elevate it into what works in stuff like Black Mirror. And what you get is just disappointed fans who are predicating their interest on watching these shows out of nostalgia anyway, looking to get that evokeness of nostalgia and enjoyment. But at the end of the day, they enjoy the old because it was popular then, not necessarily because it can be popular now. And I think because of the failure to evolve, that's what doomed those shows. And that's what really doomed this movie. Yeah, obvious stuff aside like budget, writing ability, ability to provide, maybe better effects or better editing to the film as well that could have helped it. There's not much else you can do to salvage this movie. That doesn't take away, though, I had a decent enough time with it, and I would recommend it to you, especially if you're an anthology fan looking for something different to experience out there. If I had to give this film a rating wholesale from a 0 to 5 star basis, I'd probably give this film a flat 3 out of 5 stars. I think this is a decent enough anthology film. It's not groundbreaking. It's not something that you must watch, but it is a fun shakeup, and I think worthy of a collection for you anthology fans out there that like to physically collect movies. It's not going to be for everyone, and I totally get that, but if you're the right person, give this a watch. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Locker 13. If you've seen this movie before, let me know down in the comment section, what did you think about this film? And until next time, take care.